Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Becker, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Could you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, my name is Marc Becker. I teach Latin American history at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri, rural Northeast Missouri, and I'm involved in a lot of things. I'm part of Historians for Peace and Democracy, for example. That's working toward trying to gain a more sane world in which we live.
Now, how'd you get started in Historians for Peace and Democracy?
It started as Historians Against the War in 2003 during Bush's war against Iraq and Afghanistan, and it started at American Historical Association annual meeting in Chicago, where a group of historians got together and looked at what is our responsibility as historians to confront these very pressing issues in the world today, and how can we use our expertise as historians to try to create a more just and peaceful world. And so we've been working on and from that, we've kind of like expanded out to a broad range of other issues over the last 20 years.
I think much when you look at history, you can look at it from obviously we have to do what we need to do, and you can look at it as abuses of power as well too. And I've tried to keep that balance. I'm very interested in the FBI's involvement into a lot of things, especially the CIA's involvement as well too when it comes to domestic stuff. But I always consider that like when people can just say, "Oh, like assassination of Castro, for instance," people go, "Well, Castro needed to be taken out." I was like, "Well, there's like double standards on things. Like you can't just say, oh, that's that country over there and not look at your own country as well too," which had me looking deeper into the Cold War, Nixon's administration. Everyone wants a boogeyman, but I'm like, I think as an institution, if we talk about rogue elements of the CIA or something, you just got to look at the institution as a whole, and they should be the ones that take also the whole rap for it as well too. Now, that's more of a controversial take, obviously, but I'm trying to look at history and analyze why things just immediately go to level 100. And you start reading like the history book doesn't tell you the whole details, like J. Edgar Hoover's administration invading Hollywood and Hollywood 10 profiles looking for communism. And you just kind of start understanding a little bit more of the bigger picture.
Yeah, partly, I'll tell you a little bit more about the perspective from which I approach this, that I'm not at all concerned about rogue elements in the government or the CIA. I don't think that's where our main concern should be. I think it's the overt policy of the administrations that should concern us. And I come into my work on the CIA and FBI very much on a side angle. Academically, my training is in social history, and it's trying to look at history from the bottom up rather than looking at it from the perspective of governments or from generals or kings. It's like, what is the experience for the rest of us? And my interest specifically is in social movements and the left, and how we've tried to create a more inclusive society. And part of it is before I got into academia in the 1980s, I worked in Nicaragua. And this is the time when Ronald Reagan was funding what frankly were terrorist groups called the Contras, Contra-Revolutionaries, that were invading Nicaragua from neighboring Honduras and Costa Rica and blowing up schools and health clinics and intentionally skipping military targets. There's examples where a military convoy would go down a road. They'd be sitting there ready for an ambush. That let the military convoy go by, and when the military convoy went by and then a civilian transport went by, they would hit the civilian transport. And this was very deliberate because the military had guns and they would shoot back at the Contras. But if you're attacking unarmed supporters of this revolutionary government, they can't fight back. And so this is the definition of terrorism that the U.S. that the Reagan administration was overtly supporting. And this is part of a broader policy. At the time I was living in Kansas, where Robert Dole was our senator, and he was supporting similar policies in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and in South Africa, for example. These right-wing terrorist organizations that were pressing this right-wing agenda, and there was nothing secret about it. It was an overt policy, and this is part of the deep contradiction that continues into contemporary politics. That Donald Trump put Barack Obama had taken Cuba, for example, off the list of state sponsors of terrorists. And Donald Trump put him back on, put Cuba back on. And people look at this and it's like, why? What have they done? And going back to the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara, one of the revolutionary leaders, he makes very clear statements against terrorism. He says terrorism as a political tactic is stupid. If you use these types of tactics, you're just going to alienate our supporters, and you're not engaged in serious political endeavors. That this is a political project. This is an ideological project. This isn't just a project of randomly blowing shit up. And so he makes very clear statements against terrorism. And what Trump and before him Reagan originally put Cuba on this list of state-sponsored of terrorisms, I think in 1982 or 1983, was because of their alleged support of revolutionary movements. And this is movements who are trying to free themselves from right-wing dictatorships. And drilling down into that, there's like a common trope that says one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And by definition, Reagan's policies, while he put Cuba on the list of state-sponsored terrorism in the 1980s, his overt support for the Contra in Nicaragua more clearly would meet a definition of terrorism than anything Cuba was doing at the time. But yet Reagan was calling the Contras like moral equivalents of our freedom founding fathers, and saying that they were trying to free Nicaragua from this communist tyranny, when what they were explicitly engaged in by any clear definition was terrorist actions of targeting non-military targets, targeting civilian targets.
So was this like a case of just conflicting ideologies? Like we had a certain belief or idea, and then that one was rivaling ours, and we had to. Because I talked to Greg Polgreen, who studied Alan Dulles and JFK in Indonesia, and he goes, the weirdest thing that, when he's looking at some of these documents was that someone asked the question, wait, these are communists? I thought communists weren't religious, because the longest time there was this idea of this one communism that people were bred to fear, basically. Everything influenced that this is the worst. I think even J. Edgar Hoover would not look into the mob. He wanted to squash out communism. He didn't see mob as a communist threat or anything, but they invaded a bunch of stuff. And when someone asked that question, is there another form of communism? The government was just like, yeah, there's another form. That's also communism. They could actually be religious as well, too. And it's just like, that's when you start going, wait a minute, did someone poke a hole into your idea or your communism kind of brush that you're painting on everybody? And now you start to see kind of the tearaway. I mean, it's weird when you start looking at everything like a conflicting ideology aspect of things, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, people are kind of all about egos in a sense as well, too.
In the classes where I teach Latin American history, I used to joke that understanding U.S. politics. Let me back up one step. Where I started going with this, for me to study or to criticize U.S. imperialism in Latin America, for me was like shooting fish in a barrel, proverbially, especially after living in Nicaragua, where I was evacuating people who were being targeted from the war zone by Reagan's terrorists. it's like, why do we need to study U.S. imperialism in Latin America? Tell me something interesting. It's like saying water is wet or the sky is blue. It's obvious. It's like, anybody who's there observing this can see this. This is very, very obvious. And then when I started teaching Latin American history, I started to joke with my students that explaining U.S. policy in Latin America was above my pay grade. And now I've come around to see that U.S. policy in Latin America is just really, really simple. Left bad, right good. And it doesn't go beyond that. And that anything that is mildly progressive is just painted broadly with this label of communism, and therefore seen as an existential enemy, and combated. And anything that's right is embraced. And so this echoes repeatedly across history, where and there's a whole literature on this. It's like where the U.S. will support anti-communist dictators, right-wing military dictators that in no sense are democratic, in no sense that they're not even capitalists. They're just like straight up fascists. And so, Augusto Pinochet in Chile is one of the classic examples. A much more recent example is Hernandez, Juan Orlando Hernandez, that's his brother, the former president of Honduras, who was a drug trafficker. And now he's, in trial in prison in the United States for drug trafficking. But during his 8 years in office in Honduras, the U.S. had no trouble supporting him. Trump was very, very close to him. And there's these famous pictures of Hernandez smiling, like hugging both Biden and both Trump, and being very close to all sectors of U.S. power, because he was a right-winger. And it made no difference that he was a drug trafficker, that he was anti-democratic, that he was engaged, that he would assassinate his opponents. And you just go through the whole list that the overt U.S. policy has been for 20 years now to overthrow the left-wing government in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro. And the excuse is their violation of human rights, and I don't know what else. And you go through objectively and you look at the criticism that the U.S. government has of Venezuela, and everything that they complain about Venezuela is worse in Honduras. There's things that are worse in terms of human rights violations in neighboring Colombia. But the difference is that Honduras and Colombia were under right-wing governments, and so therefore that was okay. And so this is where I come to the conclusion that the simplest interpretation is the best. That as long as it's a right-wing government, the U.S. will close its eyes to the abuses. And
would it be more simpler to say just something that they can control as well too? Like if we talk about a right-wing government establishing with the right-wing government of our own or something like that, it's just similarities. So you're probably going to have more things in common than things that are differences. So it's easier to work together in that aspect. But if you have someone that's completely against your ideologies, it's going to be very hard to create a working relationship.
yeah, and I mean, and the question then is, what would happen if Bernie Sanders were elected president with a progressive policy? Because we've never had a left-wing government in the United States, and a government that is trying to do the same thing that these left-wing governments in Latin America are doing. It's like feeding their people, giving housing for their people, giving universal health care, education, all of these social benefits. And if the U.S. policy is to overthrow progressive governments, and then the U.S. suddenly has a progressive government, does that become the policy of the U.S. government to overthrow the U.S. government then? And so there's a deep contradiction there.
I mean, when it comes to just organizations that are involved in, like, I mean, I know about regime change strategies, and they pick someone that they want to inherit that whatever that, and that's because they fit our viewpoints the best. If they don't like the person that seems mad with power or something, that they can easily. I mean, what fascinates you more, the organizations that can get involved in doing these types of strategies, or the excuses that they make that somehow, I don't even know if they make sense to the public, but it just seems like whatever we're told, it's kind of like either people don't care to look into it, or it's like, because it's obviously way more fascinating. I don't know how you justify blowing up a civilian vehicle compared to, attacking a military vehicle.
No, and the other thing, going off of what you were saying, is that what we see with these power brokers is uh, that the ruling class doesn't have any allegiance to a country. They have allegiance to their class interests, and so the and this two things here. One is that often the ruling class, this abusive ruling class, what they do in Latin America, they would do whether or not the United States existed, because they have their own class interests at play. But what happens is that because those interests, like you were talking about, ally with similar class interests in the United States, it reinforces those and entrenches those interests. And so then, I mean, you're exactly right. Like these interests align between a ruling class in the United States and a ruling class around the rest of the world, and they work together to advance this type of right-wing oppressive agenda that, in terms of its direct consequence, is denying us things like access to healthcare. I mean, how many of us have had problems getting healthcare? It's like, even if we have insurance, the insurance says we're not going to pay for that. And it's like you try to make a medical appointment and you just get like hung up, and
Or
it's like
book
you
it
just,
8 months out or something like that. Doesn't make
yeah,
sense.
you just get a runaround. And and so these governments that the United States is trying to overthrow in Latin America, that's all they're trying to do is use the resources of their countries to benefit people, to give like these basic standard of living for people in their own countries.
I mean, it's weird. I mean, whenever I read an article that says like they're afraid that it's going to come over here, like that idea is going to come over here, I was like, but you build this idea that a country is very strong. We're one of the most powerful ones on the top of the chain, and you're afraid of another country, one in Latin America, one that people are probably very disconnected to unless you study it specifically. And you're saying that this country, Cuba, could somehow take over all of America. And it's like, it doesn't make sense, which means there has to be something more underneath the surface. And then you could probably look at infrastructure, you could look at trading reasons, you could look at so many other aspects that are more profit incentivized, which is the direction I see a lot of moves start heading towards, is more about making money and what's going to be easier for us to do business. And also who's going to side with us if something does turn into a weapons fight or something like that. You have more allied powers than you do people against you. And it's just like, man, it makes it so damn confusing to try and understand policy in so many aspects. It's like, what are you guys labeling as policy?
Yeah, well, I have two responses to that. One is that if you look at how capitalism works as a global system, um, uh, one thing is one of the fatal flaws of capitalism is what alternatively is called overproduction or underconsumption. That capitalism, I mean, a standard trope is that capitalism excels at production, at creating things, but it sucks at redistributing that equitably. And so this is where socialism comes into play. It's like, how can we have a more equal distribution of goods? And so this is part of the whole history, 200 years of history of US imperialism in Latin America in particular, is that the US needs a market for its goods, a place to sell things. And so going back to the 1990s, what some people would say is the height of US imperialism in Latin America, the policymakers were overt about this. We need foreign markets in order to sell our goods to foreign markets. And the other thing is that that the US or any industrial core, any industrial power needs cheap sources of raw materials. And so this is where Latin America is trapped in this, is that that you're exporting cheap raw materials to an industrial area, whether it's Europe or the United States or wherever it is, and then those are turned into finished goods and are re-exported back out to this rural periphery. And just going back to Nicaragua, where I lived in the 1980s for a while, a classic example there is there's this Fantasma Valley in Jinotega, where I was, that could have probably fed the entire country. And this is a thing that repeats itself over and over again. But rather than growing crops to feed Nicaragua, this land is dedicated to coffee production for export, in this case to the Netherlands, to Nescafé, where then this, and the people growing this coffee wouldn't drink the coffee that they were growing, because this is your capitalist production model. This is where you get your cash, where you need to sell it to buy things. And so you'd have some of the best coffee in the world that you would sell to Nescafé in the Netherlands, who would then turn it into instant coffee and re-import that instant coffee back into Nicaragua. And so you're sitting in an area with some of the best coffee in the world, and you go to a restaurant, you get the crappiest Nescafé instant coffee. And so this is the logic of that economic model. And where does all this money go? It's so that you have, I mean, you can lay this out, that the people who are growing the coffee make a penny on every dollar of profit that's generated. And you start going through this. I've had people do models where this works for pretty much any commodity that's extracted from Latin America. Cocaine is the same way, that people who grow the coca leaves that are the raw commodity for cocaine get almost nothing and get hammered with a U.S. drug policy that tries to eradicate their coca production in Colombia in particular. But it's not those growers who are, one, benefiting from it, or two, are responsible for this whole process. It's like, it's the much higher up people who are benefiting from that whole production, who are mobilizing this. And just quickly, the other point in terms of this influence. So one, you have these economic relations, and I think the other thing that really scares the ruling class in the United States is the model that countries like Cuba provide. That Cuba has in basic health indicators, infant mortality, life expectancy, access to healthcare, all of that exceeds what we have in the United States. I live here in rural Missouri. It far exceeds what we have here in rural Adair County. That all of the problems that you have in rural America, like hospitals are closing, it's like life expectancy is declining, just like all these epidemics off the charts, and the inability of the system to address that, and somehow yet you have a ruling class that convinces poor people that this type of system somehow benefits them, when objectively it does not benefit them, because it's like the people here in rural Missouri are not getting wealthy. This is like an Appalachia type area. It's one of the poorest areas in the United States.
And I mean, even back however long ago, whenever we started getting involved in, overseas exports, I mean, we didn't notice it because it's not in our view. We can't see what's going on over there. So we just assume, well, I'm not doing bad, so everyone must be doing okay. But then like now, like at this point, it's gotten to the part where we're at, which is just I'm living, at least, it's not really this aspect of like, it's kind of crappy. People, there's food in the store, sure, but there's, someone complains about gas price that's way too high. Sometimes it is way too high, but that's our only viewpoint, is like gas is way too high. And that's all we talk about for months and months and months, not talking about what we could do to be either fixing them, what we could be doing to, I don't know, handle other situations. And then everything else has kind of just started to decline because we've been focused on one thing. Before it was about keep the people happy, in a sense, maybe not as happy as we are, but if they're a little bit happy, they're not suffering, then they're not going to look into a bunch of stuff. And then now at this point, it's like, well, they're suffering, but we can dangle some shiny keys in front of them for a minute and, they'll be happy again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is part of, I mean, this is a criticism that some people have had of, especially the AFL-CIO, the labor movement in the United States, is that it's been too tied into the capitalist production in the United States, where rather than trying to an idea of trying to redo production in a way that we control, this in a way that benefits ourselves, that that what we call the middle class is tied into these ideas of, well, this is a global system that benefits us, so we can't question it, and we must support it without recognizing how it's harming us as well, and really undermining our lives.
When did it start? Like when did like organizations get involved, like the CIA and FBI? I mean, are these people that are just like the hands? I mean, you're supposed to know the CIA from intelligence operations, and if you look at their charter, it says that they're never supposed to activate on domestic land, which I'm pretty sure we can all just take a quick laugh at because they've obviously been doing that. But I'm just curious when it comes to the involvement of these agencies that necessarily getting whatever the main purpose or main goal is to this idea of making better trade routes or getting the better agenda of what they assume to be fit across.
Going back to what I was talking about before, particularly working in Nicaragua in the 1980s, where you have like Reagan's terrorists trying to blow up healthcare centers and schools and stuff like that. When I went to graduate school, I like I said, I wasn't much interested in studying U.S. imperialism because it's like, no, duh, that this is the water in which we swim. But instead, I wanted to look at what Latin America looked like from the bottom up, from a Latin American perspective. What was the reality here? What can we learn um, from Latin American social movements? And for me, this was a really rewarding activity. I ended up, I mean, there's a longer story here, but I ended up in Ecuador in 1990 in the midst of a huge indigenous rights strike. And it's like these people who historically we've been told they're marginalized, they have no voice, they have no action. Karl Marx famously talks about peasants as being sacks of potatoes, that they're inert, that they can't act. But yet we see these people who traditionally people had seen as non-actors really taking a leading role and pressing what we'd call an anti-neoliberal agenda, saying that we need an economic model that benefits us rather than these international corporations. And so that was my whole academic project. And it was while in investigating that at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. in 1994 that I stumbled across these FBI documents in the 1940s. I was looking for information on peasant movements in 1944. There was what was called a Glorious May Revolution in Ecuador, one of these mass uprisings, which is a potential turning point where it was almost an opportunity to remake Ecuador so that it would benefit the common people rather than the ruling class in international capital. And so this running across these FBI documents just shocked me because, like you just said, this is our standard understanding that the FBI is supposed to be the political police in the United States, and the CIA is involved internationally in these nefarious activities. But the CIA was not formed until 1947. And so this is in the early 40s. So this is before the creation of the CIA. And it just threw me down this rabbit hole on two levels. On one level, it was this whole exploration of what we were talking about. It's like these counterintelligence models, these models of interference, and it turned. This is a story that few people know about, but during World War II, J. Edgar Hoover had about 700 of his agents in Latin America. And the original justification was to investigate Nazi activity. But, and there were a couple of countries like Chile and Brazil where there were some Nazis, but he spreads these throughout Latin America. And I'm studying Ecuador. There's not hardly any Nazi presence there. There's like, like a handful of people, like 5 people or something that could be German immigrants who had like this historic connection with the fatherland and all of that. But beyond that, there was no organized Nazi presence. But this is where this intersects with who Hoover is, because famously he's anti-communist. And going back to the 1920s, when he becomes the director of the FBI, going back to the Palmer raids, that he's always interested in combating communists. And so he's supposed to be here in Latin America combating Nazis, but he's always more interested in combating communists. He can turn a bit of a blind eye to the Nazis if need be. In World War II, it's a little bit more difficult, but there were ways to overcome that. And the other thing about Hoover is that at the time in the 1940s, before the CIA, this was an attempt to divide the world into different spheres of influence, where and this overlaps with the OSS in Europe, that they put the Navy in charge of one part of the world, the Army in one part of the world in terms of this intelligence gathering, and Hoover gets Latin America, which is kind of like the poor stepchild that nobody really cares about. And it's kind of like FDR. Everybody kind of is scared of Hoover and the power that he has, and so it's like, well, we'll let him have Latin America. And Hoover tries to leverage this and has this huge ego, and it keeps like bragging about like he's doing the best work here. He has and he's trying to make the FBI the global political police around the world. And it's in 1947, Harry S. Truman, fears this power and pries this away from Hoover, and instead creates the CIA in ways to supplant Hoover, in ways to create like a centralized agency. Because depending on how you count, there were about 7, maybe 9 different intelligence agencies doing exactly the same thing. The Army had one, the Navy had one, the Air Force had one, the FBI had one, the State Department had one, and I'm blanking off my head about the others. And so Truman would complain about just these cascading memos onto his desk constantly from these competing agencies, he just basically wanted one organization to take everything and to boil it down. And so this is what the CIA originally was it was just supposed to take all of this information that was coming in from all of these different agencies and turn it basically into a one-page, sometimes they called it a president's morning newspaper, like a one-page memo. What are the most important things that I need to know from today, rather than trying to read through all of this random information?
How did you know what you were looking for when you went to the archives? Did you know about the FBI and CIA involvement into Ecuador or Latin America before?
Well, I mean, everybody knows about the CIA. The CIA, Philip Agee famously was a CIA case officer in Ecuador and in Uruguay and in Mexico in the 1960s, and wrote a book called Inside the Company, where he basically spills the beans and talks about the CIA intervention in Latin America. It's one of the most significant inside reports of how the CIA operates and what it does. And so a lot of how we viewed the CIA was because of that. And I think, I mean, 2 things. One, I think that people in the know knew this, because in Agee's book, he has these passing comments about the earlier FBI activities and how there's this tension between the FBI and CIA, that you have these people who are working in Latin America for the FBI who come over to the CIA, which Hoover doesn't want them to do. It's like this interagency competition. But for me, in the archives in January of 2000, I'm losing track of my dates, 2014, almost 10 years ago, it just blew my mind, because like most of us, it's like the FBI is supposed to be in the US, the CIA is international. Why are these FBI documents here surveying, reporting on what's happening in Latin America? And for me, again, as a social historian and my interest in social movements in the left, it was just an incredible source of information, not looking at US intervention in Latin America, which we all know about, but for this really detailed reporting on what social movements are doing in Latin America, and so I'm kind of using these documents at counter purposes. Rather than looking at U.S. intervention, rather than looking at what the U.S. is doing, I'm looking at what the people who they were investigating, what they were thinking and what they were doing. And part of it is because, and other people have talked about this in using FBI documents, including in the United States, because activists are really bad for a variety of reasons at documenting their own history. It's like you burn documents. This happens in Ecuador as well. The police are coming, you burn everything, you trash everything, or if you think about it, I've done this for myself. In the 1980s, when I worked in Central American solidarity movements, we would publish these like statements, these newsletters and stuff, and they're ephemeral documents. They're for the moment. Like you're having a talk, you have a speaker, you make the stuff, you bring it to the talk, but once the talk is over, why am I dragging this box? You know, we have like a huge box of stuff that we would drag around, and occasionally we go through. It's like, oh, this is old. Let's throw this away. Throw this away. And so for a while, I published a newsletter for our local Latin American Solidarity Committee. And I went back through my archives, and I don't have a full run of these newsletters that I edited, that I published, that I put together. And so then you start asking, well, who has a copy of these? Well, it's the FBI. We have our FBI documents from our solidarity group, and they had a snooping on our group, and we're monitoring everything that we were doing. And so it's the political police who keep all of these documents for us. And so as a historian, trying to recover this history of social movements, and particularly of the left, you know, it's the state security apparatus that become really great archivists.
What did you find out about the FBI's tactics that they used against people that might have been sparking social change? I know about the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover in particular invasion into the Black Panther Party. I mean, a bunch of things where you start going, so all these giant messes that we have in history that are labeled as messes, they're messes because you made them messes. You know, you got involved, and it was this idea. I mean, they labeled Frank Sinatra a communist in one of his files on the FBI site, but a common misconception is the idea that people think the CIA and the FBI work together. If I could tell you the number of documents I've looked through where like we don't trust the FBI and it's a CIA document, you're like, hold on a second, you guys are our military. You guys are supposed to be talking to each other. That's not it at all. They're all doing things under each other's noses, and they all don't trust each other as well either.
Yeah, let me go backwards or forward and then backwards a little bit, because going to the creation of the CIA in 1947, like I said, Hoover wanted Truman wanted it as a group in Washington who compiled intelligence information and collected and analyzed that information. And whether you believe it or not, later he said that creating the CIA was his worst mistake, because he said they became monsters who acted on their own. The CIA basically breaks into like three different categories. One, you have these analysts, like they're the top ranks, they're the eggheads in Washington who are taking this information and analyzing it. And the second ones are people like Philip Agee, who I was talking about, who are collecting this information on the ground for the analysts in Washington. And that's largely what the FBI was doing in the 1940s, where I started this project. And the third was like what the others would derogatorily call like the guerrillas or the knuckle draggers, the grunts, who were actually involved in covert action, who are doing the dirty deeds that we were referencing earlier. These are the ones who are trying to assassinate Fidel Castro in Cuba, for example, and engaging in these terrorist activities, these illegal activities. And this is what, and so I'm always surprised that more information doesn't come out about this. And when it comes out, it just comes out in bits and pieces. But like so these were the covert operatives who were training like the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s, for example, in these terrorist activities. And it comes out in really weird ways. That there's a 1985 movie called Latino, which for me is just a fascinating movie, because it's in the middle of Reagan's war in Nicaragua, and it's a war, and it's a story about uh, a Latino. I forget which branch of the military he works for, some special forces, and he gets sent to Nicaragua to train these contras in their terrorist activities. And he gets there and he realizes, oh my God, this is like, one, it's immoral, and B, it's completely against my own interest to be because these people are just like trying to feed themselves. And why are we blowing up their grain bins? This is all we're doing. We're not fighting communism. We're just fighting people who are trying to feed themselves. And to make that in 1985 during the war, and basically just calling out and saying that that the CIA is engaged in these terrorist activities is surprising. And a couple of years later, I met somebody who had been in Nicaragua with the special forces, and I never figured out what he was trying to tell me, but he was saying, it's like, well, when I left the military, I had to sign these 10 documents that I would never think or talk or say anything about this activity. And in ways, he was confessing that he was involved in these terrorist activities in Nicaragua. And so it's kind of surprising that more people who have been involved, for me, it's more surprising that there aren't more Philip Agees who have just spilled the beans. Or maybe there are, and we just haven't listened because we don't, it's convenient not to listen to this.
I think it's hard. A lot of them are threatened with jail time, and a lot of that, I think we have a deathbed confession from Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate burglars, who talks about, he made a video for his son on his deathbed talking about, ideas of slathering LSD on a driver's steering wheel and hoping that person drives into traffic. Doesn't even matter if they attempted to do that. It's just the idea that that's people in your institutions that are talking like that makes you kind of set the bar to a level where it's like, okay, anything could kind of be possible when we start talking about ideas that can, things get labeled conspiracy pretty quickly. There are obviously crazy stuff out there, but there is like weird things where it's hard to believe. Manipulation of media, that's a stereotype. But then when you see a document, I don't know how many documents I've came across, and it's an interesting question for you, which is the CIA's involvement in Nicaragua. Did it all just entail like terroristic acts or just things that are meant to like, blow something up or practice or anything? Or is there other like, because I hate to ask you a JFK question, but Ruth Payne is like a name that people call an intelligence operative. And I don't know all the details on that, but she was in Nicaragua, and people have linked a lot of documents. And I've seen documentation by the CIA about Ruth Payne and her involvement in Nicaragua. And I was like, okay, so what was the CIA doing around the late 50s and the 60s in Nicaragua? I don't know if you would have an answer to that question, but I'm just curious.
The part of it is that I don't know, and maybe we don't know, and it's like, and I think often people who are involved don't know that the here, let me fill in a little bit more of the story, and I'll come around and answer your question. Is that from what I can figure out, before the 1950s, this type of like covert action, terrorist activity that we're talking about, like spreading stuff on people's steering wheels, I'm not aware that it happened. That going back like 100 some years, the US would land gunboats, like in Haiti and Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Cuba, and just take over the country with overt military force. I'm not aware that this type of covert activity was happening then. And in the FBI documents I'm looking at from the 1940s, I have no evidence that these FBI agents were ever trying to operationalize the information that they were collecting. The collection happened on 3 levels. I don't know if this is relevant, but just to fill it in, the classic post, and this is still true for CIA operatives in Latin America, is in the political affairs department of the U.S. Embassy, that they're giving, and it's the FBI and CIA did it differently, but both of them were given cover as embassy officials. And this has long been a joke, if that the political officers in U.S. embassies are probably CIA operatives. And so that was one of the main covers that how they would put FBI and CIA agents in Latin America and continue to do so. And the other, and I assume this is still going on, is that they would pretend to work for a business. And often the main corporations like General Motors and Ford, et cetera, would be more than happy to pretend that one of the CIA or FBI case officers were working for the corporation, and that's how they would go in there. And the other is undercover, where that they would pretend to be like a tourist or something like that. And there's these stories from FBI. There's one story from FBI, one of these FBI agents in Mexico in the 1940s. And he says, this is a real joke, that I was supposed to be just like a tourist traveling through Mexico, but a cop can smell another cop from a mile away. And all the cops knew that I was a cop. And it was like a really lame cover. But to get to the key question there is, why in the world is the US collecting all of this information? And I have another quote from, he wasn't a CIA, this is from the 1960s. He was a non-CIA political officer. And he talks about how the embassy was just endlessly collecting all of this information. He says, why are we collecting this information? What does anybody do with this? He says, Washington must be the best informed place in the world. And this is the information as a historian for me is just a rich raw material. And this is how I was using these FBI documents, because they're collecting information that have nothing overtly to do with imperial policy, with economics. It's just like really random information. But in a case where you don't have any information, it's really great information to have. And so that's always a question that's kind of like hanging out there. Why? Why does the U.S. need all of this random information? Why does the U.S. government rather need all this? Because we don't have the information as U.S. citizens. This is like government officials have this. I always make that distinction. We're talking about government officials. Why are they collecting all this information? What are they doing with it? Yeah. And
It's future intelligence operations is probably my guess. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover was well known for blackmailing a lot of people for getting. I mean, that's part of America also in some aspects, is being curious about what everybody else is doing and making sure that we have a profile in case something goes bad or something else you want to do comes down later down the pike. I spoke to a guy who works at the Assassination Records Review Board for the JFK assassination. His name's Judge Thunheim. He believes Oswald did it. I would show you a bunch of evidence that doesn't, but I like talking to people from all perspectives on this. And I asked him, I was like, so what was the classification for releasing documents? How do you know what can be unredacted? And he was like, usually if it's like something like a personal matter, you have to contact the family or something like that. But, or it's an intelligence operation that's still going on today. And I go, there's over 12,000 something documents that are still left in the Kennedy assassination. You telling me something might still be going on in that aspect? He goes, that would be the only thing, but I couldn't see what it would be. And when I mentioned about Ruth Payne, she was over there taking pictures, part of a church group. It was her and some other person, but there was no other people with them. And they were taking photos. So we know that they were there and they were spreading out this magazine. And then I started learning about the Radical Observer, which was a fake magazine that was brought into college institutions. I'm like, were we using propaganda in the worst possible way to distort another country's perspective or make them influence a thought or idea to do something? And that was happening in Cuba. So I would not put that out of the mix of things that were going on in Ecuador. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah, a couple things here. One is that I don't know if this is true or not, and partly it's like it's hard to get some of these documents, but there's some people who say this is the whole role of the Peace Corps is just to get this information. And so you have these really naive, like 20-year-olds working around the world who are just collecting this information on local social leaders, like community leaders, that may be useful. Like you're saying, that we're not going to do anything right now, but if there's a revolution, it would be really useful to know who has control in this community. A second thing is that both of the FBI and CIA documents I've looked at, it's that they infiltrated people into organizations. And sometimes it's a question of, why are you infiltrating people into these organizations, particularly since they're harmless, they're not doing anything. And maybe part of, I mean, if you want to be conspiratorial in your thinking, maybe it's to make sure that they aren't harmless. And when we requested in the 1980s our FBI records on our Central American Solidarity Group, they didn't release all the documents because they said that the investigation is ongoing. And that's when you're sitting around a table looking at each other and say, okay, one of us at this table is still reporting on our activities to the CIA or to the FBI in the United States. And that's incredibly destructive for the dynamics of a group, because and this is what some people say, it's not that the FBI or CIA, either in the United States or internationally, are operationalizing this, but if you create this paranoia, it prevents people from organizing, prevents us from getting around and doing and just is that really disruptive activity. And one final thing, it's like I've been filing FOIA documents, Freedom of Information Act documents, and the FBI, both the FBI and CIA, are really what's the word I want? Really stingy. They don't want to let their
Yeah, they
documents
are.
go. And so it's really hard to get documents out. And
it takes months and so much money to try and get a document. I've talked to so many people that are like, I sent this away 3 years ago. And I was like, oh.
I mean, and I get a request back and it's like 90% of it's redacted. And part of what I need more resources to pursue this properly, and partly I'm not sure that it's worth pursuing, because some of the documents that they refuse to release I have from other sources, particularly from the National Archives in DC. And this is one thing. Well, I could pull up examples, but the CIA, for better or worse, has dumped a lot of their FOIA documents, their Freedom of Information Act documents, on their website. They have a reading room that just has like, I don't know, tens, hundreds of thousands of documents. And there are documents in there that have been redacted at 2 different times, have been released at 2 different times with 2 different sets of redactions. And so you can compare these documents and you can see what has been redacted, what 2 different people at 2 different times redacted. And you're looking at this and it's like, why did you redact that information? What's going on here? That what you're withholding has doesn't say anything. It's like, what were you thinking in redacting that? And there's a historian, Charles, what's his name, Amiger, who has this great quote where he talks about all the redactions do all they do is show just how mundane of journalistic activity the CIA was engaged in. And this is I'm really butchering that quote, but the whole point here is that sometimes we overestimate the capability of the government, you know, like, and that's kind of the joke. It's like, if you see how incompetent the government is, why, you know, what's to make us think that the CIA or FBI are any more competent than the Division of Motor Vehicles in terms of actually doing stuff? And so I think sometimes we have an inflated sense of what these agencies are really capable of doing.
I do, and I also kind of tackle it from the other side as well too. Like, I know about gun running, and I know about a bunch of stuff that I would have even assumed would have been possible, arming friendlies or resistance fighters for a particular purpose of regime overthrow or something of that sort. And the weird thing is, with the documents I've looked at on the FBI and CIA website, and I just scrolled through looking to see if I saw anything interesting that I might click into. But I boiled a lot of my stuff to the JFK assassination, in particular, the involvement in Mexico and so much of that. And I mean, they were documents that were previously unredacted or redacted. They got re-redacted, or they just took them away. They took them off. And I'm just like, well, hang on a second. There's over so many documents. We're so lucky the government has like 3 copies of one memo. Like, I get that. They're thorough, but that's a dangerous thing when you have such a large number if you don't have it saved on your computer. And then they put at the bottom of it, this is strictly for the sole person this is being released to, not for anybody else. I'm like, well, how else are we going to share it? Are you saying you're going to sue me if I try and share and expose what you were doing? And I think that's a really, like, I mean, we say, I guess our government's pretty transparent, but I don't think it's transparent in the way that it should be transparent. I mean, if you look into the assassination and all, like, sorry if I'm using examples to this, but the Warren Commission was the first investigation into the president. They were thorough, but in every aspect, it shouldn't have been thorough. Why is the strip club owner who shot Oswald's mother's dental records in there? It just, there's this weird, like, okay, what about the actual investigation? And you kind of realize that they left out witnesses and they did a bunch of stuff. I'm not saying it's all a conspiracy. I'm just looking at it like, you guys picked up documents on things, and you guys, what we would consider side information, they considered crucial. And I'm just kind of assuming that that's got to be like that with other things. I mean, they had Castro's eating whereabouts and all these things for an assassination attempt, rather than focusing on the moves that he was making secretly that nobody was talking about as well either. And I'm like, so you didn't prioritize that, but you prioritized when he got his favorite drink from his favorite restaurant. That just, your priorities are off. And that's what I kind of started looking through and started seeing. And I'm curious if that's just always been like that. If we just assume that this was vital information, I would assume infiltrating a group would be to check if there was any hostilities or anything like that. But then what is about gatekeeping information? What happens if someone's talking about something that in your eyes you deem hostile, and then now you consider them a communist threat? And that's what kind of scares me, is like, maybe there are people that are just talking and letting out some frustrations or something, and that could be insinuated as a threat.
I mean, I joked earlier that that U.S. policy in Latin America is really simple. It's like, left bad, right good, and maybe that's way too trite, because uh, I mean, one thing that we see in history is that there's never a singular explanation for anything, and and another thing is, like, never mistaken incompetence for innocence. Here, let me make 2 points. One is that Seven Stories Press has this book, 634 Ways to Kill Fidel,
Yeah.
and it goes through, and this is like overt. Again, this is my point. This is overt U.S. policy. They're using the CIA covert operatives not as rogue elements, but as overt U.S. policy, and repeatedly attempting to kill Fidel Castro. And this is one thing that's always just blown my mind. How did Operation Mongoose fail? It's like all of these attempts. It's like, one of my conspiracy theories is that Fidel was killed early on, and he just had a lot of body doubles that lived on for decades. Because is the U.S. government really? That's my whole point. Is it really that incompetent that it has all these
If
resources?
you've
And
read some of those assassination attempts, I've read a couple, and I was like, I would have been dead day one, because it explosive. I'm not going to check a cigar if it's explosive or poisonous. Jesus.
yeah. And the other point, in response to your question, it's like, and this is my point in saying that needing to look at multiple factors. I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Hoover, looking specifically at my case in the FBI in Latin America in the 1940s, that a lot of the explanation here for what the FBI is doing, I don't think has that much to do with class politics or U.S. policy. It has to do with J. Edgar Hoover's famous megalomania, that he wanted to control the world. And I don't think that some of this goes beyond that he just wanted all information. And yeah, of course, he had all these files on Marilyn Monroe and on everybody to blackmail people. But why do you have I mean, just give it one of my examples. It's like there's Nela Martinez is a feminist, a leftist feminist in Ecuador in the 1940s, and they're looking for a picture and handwriting samples for her. The FBI agents in Ecuador are to complete their file on her. And why do they need why do they need handwriting samples in a picture of of this person? It's it's hard to argue that she's a threat to U.S. security or anything like that. And it seems to be go nowhere beyond, like, Hoover just wants all of this information because he a sense of power. Information is power.
I think he eventually got very, very paranoid. especially towards more when the involvement when Nixon started becoming when Nixon eventually created his own FBI in the White House and then J. Edgar Hoover died. I think he was. I mean, his fear for Nixon. Nixon was like, "You need to help me out with a couple of these things and get the FBI on board." And J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't move about it. And you need J. Edgar Hoover because he's in charge. All these FBI guys trust him. He's got seniority and all these things. Well, he got a lot of stuff that was going on that we ended up finding out later. And I think that was the fear was like he's spreading himself a little bit too thin on so many things and being monitoring so many different people that he couldn't keep track of a lot of it and he couldn't extend the resources out for Nixon. And I mean, he had to be so paranoid on so many aspects of so many things. I mean, I get making a profile on somebody, but the things that they collected on certain individuals. And I was like, did you think at one point this person was just radically going to turn around the opposite way and become a threat to democracy or your idea of order? And I have no clue because honestly, the amount of stuff he was involved in, the amount of information he was probably consuming, things that you shouldn't know that much about someone's personal life or just involvement with connections of mob, whatever. I go, something else is going on. And I think it was that paranoia aspect of things too. I think even with the conspiracy, and this is what I would deem a conspiracy, would be the J. Edgar Hoover pictures and address that the mob allegedly had. It was to rationalize J. Edgar Hoover not wanting the mob. Honestly, I think the real rational take here is that he wanted state police to focus on that because he was more worried about communism. And I think if you look at his track record, this idea of communism, someone pissed in his Cheerios who was a communist because he was just there was an outright attack for that and everything that didn't fit his idea of a perfect person or a perfect 9 to 5 worker was this idea of a communist. And that's where you get the underground news press in DC and Virginia that came out. And man, I couldn't tell you that, man. I mean, if we could go have a time machine and interview that guy, holy crap, you'd probably hear some stories.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and going back to one thing you were talking about before, it's like in ways it sometimes surprises me what documents the U.S. government is willing to release that the CIA and FBI, the FBI has their vault and the CIA has their reading room where they'll dump all these documents on, and partly it's a legislative policy that they have to do it. Partly, I have a friend who works in the EPA, for example, in the FOIA department there, Freedom of Information Act, and partly it's the civil servants who are some of these people. All people. One thing I've learned is that all people in the U.S. government aren't bad. There are some really decent human beings there who are basically on our side and want us to have this information for whatever reason, and but also I don't, I don't trust the government, and
I don't
that's why
either.
I grab all these documents as fast as I can because well, I don't know. This happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, and I missed my window there where after the fall of the Soviet Union, they opened up the old Soviet archives for a while, for a couple of years, and all this information tumbled out, and then it was before Putin, I forget who it was, closed them back down and made it much harder to get these documents. And so this is me just being a greedy historian. It's like just grabbing all the documents while I can as fast as I can. And it goes back to what you're talking about sometimes. And this is when I look at these FOIA documents that I begin to realize that sometimes the redactions don't make sense until you see other documents, and then it starts fitting together, and you make these connections. And so I have a bibliographic database called EndNote where I dump everything in, and it helps me trace these connections that you were talking about before, and that's when I can begin to make sense of like a broader picture of what's going on here, where you see people popping up in different ways. And because sometimes when you look at a name or something in isolation, it's like that doesn't mean anything. But then you say, well, this person was also here, 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 here. Oh, now I'm beginning to understand something here.
I got lucky because when I was looking through documents about the assassination through the National Archives and things, I didn't know anything really about the Kennedy assassination. I've only been in it like 3 months now, but I've spoken to as many experts as I possibly can. And now I know what names to look for. But I also go, it was that not knowing that helped me find some very crucial documents that actually a couple friends of mine who run the conference every year in Dallas are going to be showing some of the documents that I found because I didn't know. I was just clicking every single document and I was just like, okay, so what's this one? You end up finding a piece of gold and you send it over to someone who might know what it's about and they find something interesting. But what to me was enlightening was when you read at the bottom of a document, destroy when no longer needed. And I get fear here because I'm like, Well, is this gonna be like when 2 groups are fighting and they forgot why they're fighting and they've been fighting for so long? I go, when someone comes at us all pissed off, do we just assume that this person's crazy? Or maybe did we do something first? And that could have been in one of those documents that I started realizing it's like, it's not just this idea of protecting your own ass, but it's this aspect of you're messing with the historical record here. And if there's information that should be added to actually get the historical exact value of what it is, not just the one you choose to write because you want to look like a strong hero. And I go, I'm not left or right in politics. I can tell you that. If I would, I don't really vote, but if I would vote, it'd be independent. But I just go, I mean, I don't like this idea that, it's just the lies. Like, that's a very tough section. It's probably where I've been getting obsessed with is that I think everyone's susceptible to corruption. But when we start getting down to the basic roots of a lot of things, I mean, people have a voice. We can raise a voice in so many aspects of things, but I think it's about like showing people what you can see in a document that would just have anybody appalled at but what they see. But I don't know what documents, it's like I said, or like you said, it's surprising what they do release. I mean, I just picture one person go, "Hey, did you release those documents?" Go, "Yeah, I released all the ones in that section." That section over there, and they see like MK Ultra on the news or something. He's like, "Oh," like there's that slip up, but it just seems like at this point it's been so long. Are people still going to care? And that's what I try and prioritize is that you should care about a lot of aspects of history. The Cold War matters, the things in the 20s matter, a bunch of things matter, not just our history, other people's history as well too.
For what it's worth, I mean, again, I was using police archives. Some of the best documentation I found in my historical research in Ecuador, in Latin America, were in police archives, and that's how I approach these FBI and CIA documents. And for what it's worth, that there are some famous terror archives in Latin America, particularly in Paraguay and Guatemala. And some people say what it goes along with what you're saying, that this doesn't just happen in the United States. That some people say that one, it's interagency fights, and the other part is that they say that it's possible that they released these archives to distract from these other archives. That the really good stuff was really in either in a competing agency, or they released some of the documents to hide the fact that the really good stuff they're not releasing. And one conspiracy story I'll throw at you for what it's worth. You can do with it what you want, but when you go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and you want to make copies of documents, you need to get a declassification. And so I'm looking at stuff from Ecuador from the 1940s. It was like, who cares about this? And one time I bring this box up, and the archivist is looking through it and says, "You want to make copies of this?" I say, "Yeah." "Is there a problem?" He says, "Well, is there anything here on the Kennedy assassination?" It's like, "No, this is 1940s Ecuador." He says, "Okay, I'll let you copy them." And I don't know if the name Henry Wade means anything to you,
Yeah,
Robbie.
yeah, it
Tell us who Henry Wade is.
I'm not getting into all this. I'm gonna get in so much.
No,
I can't. No, just no.
one identification. He was a district attorney who in Dallas, who investigated uh, the Kennedy assassination. The guy Ruby, who shot Oswald. And one thing that you maybe don't know about Henry Wade, for other people who Wade is also the Wade in Roe versus Wade in the abortion case. He's famous for both the Kennedy assassination and Roe versus Wade, but most people, probably nobody listening to this, knows that the other thing that Henry Wade was, he was a FBI agent in Ecuador in the 1940s.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
No, nobody knows this, and the reason why I know it is because of it's because of the Kennedy assassination. That I forget off the top of my head the
Should
details,
be
but
Avardo is his name. There's a document about a guy from Nicaragua, allegedly, and J. Edgar Hoover proved this wrong, that a guy named Avardo, he was interrogated with LSD. There's an interrogation document you can read about this, but as double agent and Avardo saw Lee Oswald hand $6,000 or get $6,000 from allegedly a red-haired, and this the document's words, Negro. It was all fabricated. It's not real. It was not a true story at all. The guy was a liar. He was later interrogated with LSD to prove that that was wrong. But they started wondering if Nicaragua was this area that was trying to put in disinformation or do something, or might have had some involvement into the assassination. I don't believe that at all. I think J. Edgar Hoover lied about a lot of stuff. Like, there's multiple accounts of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico back, I mean, in the United States in less than like a day, shooting at a gun range and shooting other people's targets, saying, I'm going to do this to the president of the United States. That does not sound like the Lee Oswald that is there. And then they found out that there was people using his name. And there's a memo in Mexico City where they gave a description of a 6'2", 190-pound guy in front of the embassy there. And Oswald was like 5'8" and like 150 pounds. So someone was using his name and spoke fluent Russian, and his Russian was terrible. It was not good at all. So there's a lot of like just confusion aspects where it's like, is this all real articles, or what's the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
That's funny about the Kennedy assassination thing, because that's the one thing I usually hear about the archives is people going there to look for documents on the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that cracked me up about Henry Wade is that the Hoover was always wanted to keep his agents private, didn't want to release their names, and he outed Henry Wade in the investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And I don't remember. I'd have to look up the details off the top of my head, but it goes into this whole conspiracy things that he was saying. Well, this one document can't be true because Henry Wade, for example, was a case officer or a agent of mine in Ecuador in the 1940s, and this isn't how the FBI does things, and it was trying to disprove something related to what you're talking about right now broadly in terms of how the FBI operates. And but part of it is that's how I find out some of this information is just inadvertently releasing information that at the time seems completely meaningless, but you can draw these connections and sometimes you find out
I would,
interesting things.
I mean, even with Warren or Alan Dulles, he was in charge of the MK Ultra project, and Julian West was an MK Ultra worker with Sidney Gottlieb, and I talked to Stephen Kinzer on my show about that. Man, nobody disclosed that Joyon West gave Jack Ruby a flu shot and was his therapist. And that's when Jack Ruby started having horrible visions. And if you call that a conspiracy, I don't, because we have documentation. You can look up his name on Wikipedia. It'll tell you worked for CIA under LSD experimentation, brainwashing people during the Korean War, because we used biological weapons over there. It was like this idea that the Korean people brainwashed them to think that they used biological weapons. They didn't. Really, they were unbrainwashed or brainwashed again to forget what they did over there. So we would have complete amnesty because you broke the Geneva Convention or Geneva rules. And Julian West was his therapist. It's stamped. I have every psychiatric record. It's stamped at the bottom right, but the CIA, there's no documents on them. And that's because in MK Ultra, they destroyed a lot of their documents once these people left the agencies. And it's like, that wasn't disclosed during their investigation, and it would have been, but it was top secret, so nobody there needed to know about it. And then you look at Alan Dulles, he might have been the director, but did he know what was going on in all these programs? Probably not. He probably got like a summarization of it on his desk. And then you get into this aspect of like, people can point and say, he's the guy, he's the guy. I'm like, honestly, it's a group effort. There's a lot of stuff that's going on under people's noses, and I believe it's called the blue sky memo, which is make everything appear that it's like a blue sky. And that's where they would just voice jobs, or they would voice things to people, and they wouldn't have a document to write it down. And that's where you have to keep in, and that leads into speculation, which I don't like. I'd rather just stick to what the document would tell me to. But I don't know, man. It's fascinating as hell when you start diving down it.
Well, and just one final thing. This is what some diplomatic historians talk about, that we keep looking for a smoking gun document, and some people say that these smoking gun documents don't exist because these people were careful enough. This goes back to like Eisenhower in the 1950s, that the things that we really want to know were always offered in oral orders, so that there were no traces and they were easily deniable. And so I mean, I'm a historian. I work in written documents, and like I said, I'm greedy. I'll grab all the documents I can. But I think some of these things we'll never know, because they the most important things probably weren't written down, and intentionally, so we don't know them.
Well, I'm just happy there's people, historians like yourself, that are at least trying to put together some resemblance of the piece of this puzzle, or just the big picture in general, just for other people like myself to be able to learn more. I mean, I had no idea about Ecuador or any of these Latin American countries' involvements with the CIA and FBI. And I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show as well, too. Mark, is there a place where people can find your links?
Um, Everything I have on my is on my website. Yachana, which is a Quechua word that means to know. It's YACHANA.org. And actually, I have a redirector, Marc Becker, my name, MarcBecker.org will also take you to that website.
You have Twitter?
I do. Marc Becker, I think I'm just at Marc Becker.
I'm going to follow you when we get done this. Mark, I'm going to link all your links, and I'll find your links as well too if you have any other links out there, and any other redirects, obviously, from your website that have any other articles or something that you wrote. But seriously, man, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks for listening to this episode, Out of the Blank.